This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Steer clear of Mickey Mouse succession and build a Lion King legacy. Welcome to Construction Genius. And today's episode, if you're listening to it, is actually a good episode to check out on YouTube because I'm recording my screen and I have a PowerPoint presentation. Woo! Get some. Okay, how many of you have seen the movie The Lion King? At the beginning of the movie, Simba, the successor to Mufasa, is presented. And the intention is for Simba to take over Pride Lands from Mufasa. But then Scar, the envious uncle, disrupts the succession plan, kills Mufasa, banishes Simba, and takes over the throne. We have that one image of Simba beseeching his father to get up. But we know that his father is dead and he will not be getting up. So, what does the Lion King teach us about succession planning? And it's really interesting when we ask that question because who produced or created and published the Lion King movie? We all know that it is Disney. And just like in the Lion King, Disney's succession plan has been derailed. And so my intention in today's episode of Construction Genius is to take a look at the challenges that Disney has experienced, not only in fantasy with movies like The Lion King, but actually in reality with their own business when it comes to succession planning. And use that as a tale for us to consider when we are looking at our succession plans, and specifically for you to consider when you are looking at your succession plan. Because you might be like Mickey Mouse, if you're looking at my screen here, going along thinking everything's going great with your succession plan, when in fact, it could be a little bit like Goofy, where there's a lot of stumbles and a lot of difficulties and challenges. So Bob Iger is well known by many, many people, and he became the CEO of Disney in 2005. And under his leadership, Disney grew tremendously through a combination of acquisitions of intellectual property such as the Star Wars universe, Marvel, and other entities, as well as technological advancements and global expansion. And his successor was Bob Chapek. And Bob's background was a little bit different than Bob Chapek's background, a little bit different than Bob Iger's. He started at Disney in 1993, and some of his career highlights include being the chairman of Parks and Resorts, and he was Iger's hand-picked successor in 2020. Very interesting. Iger picked him because he was instrumental in helping him. Bob Chapek was instrumental in helping Bob Iger to overcome some of the challenges associated with the construction of Disney Shanghai. And Bob Chapek was known in Disney as a very successful operator, whereas Bob Iger was known very much for his creativity, the relationships that he built not only internally in Disney, but also externally with the creative world that drove, or that does drive in many ways, the heart of what Disney does. And by 2022, the succession plan between Bob Iger and Bob Chapek was very much a failure. And I'm presenting this here not to dump on Disney in any way. That is not the point. The point is to learn from other people's successes and failures, and hopefully to be able to take some of that learning and reflect on succession planning in our businesses. And that's what I'd like you to do today as you're listening to this episode, is to reflect on your succession plan. Because if you own a construction company, or if you're a part owner of the construction company, you have three basic options when it comes to succession planning. First one is that you can shut it down. I just would like to make a point here as we're diving into this discussion, that it is perfectly acceptable for you to shut your business down. You've started it, and it can be whatever you want it to be. So if you come to the end of your run and you say, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to sell the equipment, and I'm going to shut it down, and I'm going to take my money, and I'm just going to move on to the next phase of my life, that is perfectly acceptable. Many of you who are listening to this episode today, who own construction companies, that's not really what you'd like to do. And so that leaves you then with two other options. You can either sell your company externally, or you can sell it internally. What I mean by selling it externally, I know many of the companies I work with are mechanical contractors, and there are a number of companies in the mechanical contractor space, large companies that run their businesses by buying out other locally based successful mechanical contractors. And that is a legitimate exit strategy, or succession strategy, is to sell it externally. Or you could sell your company internally. And there's a number of different vehicles that you can do to sell it internally. One particular one that you can look at, search for the Construction Genius episode that I did quite a while ago now with some of my business colleagues and associates from BFBA. And I'm just going to pull that up for you right now, which I'm going to find out here which episode that is. Episode that you want to look at is episode 125. And it's called Exit Strategy Experts: How to Structure and Execute a Transition to the Next Generation. And this is with one of my colleagues or colleague companies, BFBA. So that's one way that you can structure your business to sell it internally. Because the reality is your business run is going to come to an end at some point. We cannot avoid death and taxes. And as you sit in your business at the moment, you're tremendously busy and you don't have a lot of time, and you may feel really good right now. And so with all that busyness, you're making good money and you're not really focused on the succession planning aspect of your business. And if that's the case, then you fall in a bucket with about 70 to 80% of other small businesses and even large businesses that don't have a succession plan in place. The purpose of today's episode is really to get you thinking about that and to provide you with some resources to make some progress on your succession plan. You must start succession planning. Whatever you choose to do in terms of whether you shut your business down, sell it externally, sell it internally, you've got to put a plan in place for that. Okay, so there's three things that we're going to take a look at today in this episode. The first one is the decision that you have to make. And that decision very much revolves around this whole idea of when and how you're going to move on, or do you just stick around? It's a decision that you have to think through, because this is one of the big challenges that Bob Iger had, is processing that decision. The second thing you want to look at is the structure of your succession plan. And as you ride off into the sunset, and perhaps it's not only you that's going off into the sunset, but it's the people who have been with you, perhaps your co-owners or your key executives. They're coming to the end of the run, so to speak. And how are you going to structure the succession so that you're passing on the business, particularly if you're doing that internal sale, to the next generation in such a way that they'll be glad to take over and be able to carry the business forward? And then the last thing we're going to take a look at is the lessons from what we've learned. And those lessons are very important to consider, because one of the big issues that many succession planning processes have is that the person who owns the construction company. They decide to move on, but they, in fact, end up sticking around. And that whole messiness causes the succession plan to not be effective. And that's exactly what happened at Disney, by the way. And we need to really address that. Okay, so let's first talk about your decision to move on or stick around. You got to take a look in the mirror. Now, if you're in your 50s, you're no longer in your 30s, right? And I know that's an obvious statement, but it means something. You don't necessarily have another 25 years to go. And you know that the last 20 or 25 years went very quickly, particularly if you've been running a construction company. And you've got to look in the mirror and figure out, how much longer do I have in the business? How much juice do I have left? Do I really want to be in the position that I'm in currently, bearing the responsibilities and the risk that I bear? And if the answer to that is yes, then that's tremendous. But if the answer to that is no, then as you look in the mirror, you need to think through, how is it that I'm going to set up the business for the future so that I'm able to pass it on, if I want to the next generation of owners? Because you've put in the blood, sweat, and the tears. You've put that in. And so what would be a great outcome of a succession plan for you? And again, if you're listening to this, you should really check out the YouTube video, because some of the visuals here are going to be very helpful to you. On the screen, I have a page from the succession planning framework that I use with all of my clients when we're going through these types of discussions, because this is part of the coaching and strategic planning practice that I have with construction companies. It includes succession planning. And the first thing you want to do is take your time and go through a series of questions. And some of those questions include, the first one being, what does succession planning mean to you? And that's a good question for you to ask, because it might mean something different to you than it does to somebody else. What would be the great outcome of a succession plan? In other words, on your last day of work, if you decide not to die in the saddle, on your last day of work, as you're walking out the door, how is the company structured? Who's in places of responsibility? How much money have you generated as a result of the succession plan, perhaps of an internal or external sale? What is the outcome of a great succession plan for you? What is the timing to create that plan? What is the timing for the execution of the plan? What is driving the need for a succession plan? Maybe you have health issues that you maybe haven't shared with other people. Maybe it's, again, that internal motivation and drive that has dropped off and you're done. Another question: who else besides yourself should be involved in this process? Succession planning typically is not a one-person decision. It requires the collaboration of others. So these are just a few of the questions that I encourage my clients to dig deep into when they are thinking about succession planning. Let's talk a little bit more about the motivations that you might have behind succession planning. Perhaps one of those motivations is to leave a legacy. And I'd like you to consider for a moment the legacy that you currently have, which is absolutely tremendous if you've run a successful business for any period of time. You can drive down the street, you can point to a construction project, and you can say with pride, I built that. Now, obviously, you may have collaborated with other people in the building, but you know that you've had a tremendous impact upon the built environment of the communities that you operate in. And perhaps you want to continue that legacy. I know many of the clients that I work with are multi-generational. Some have been in business for over 100 years. Some have single-digit contractors' licenses in the states that they operate in. And with that in mind, they have a tremendous legacy and a tremendous positive impact on their communities. Perhaps you want to take care of your guys, the men and women who have committed to your company over the years. And one of the reasons you want your company to go on is because you understand that not only do you have an impact on the built environment, but you have an impact on the lives of your employees and the lives of their families. Think about that for a moment. If you employ a couple hundred of people in your organization, you know the 5 or 10-fold impact that that has upon the people that they support and that they influence and impact through the money that they get from working for you. Again, we consider these things, and these are not light things. These aren't just meaningless things. These are tremendously meaningful. And then think about the money that you would like to get out of your business. You've put in the blood, the sweat, the tears, and if you've run a successful business, obviously you've made good money. But there's also other financial rewards that you may feel that you are due, that you've earned, and you want to make sure that you reap those financial rewards from your business. These are just a few of the motivations that you may have as you're thinking about your succession plan. And so you have to ask, when am I going to set aside time for this planning? And my recommendation for you is that you set aside at least a couple of hours every month to think about your succession plan. And this goes for someone who is starting their business or who has been in business for a number of years. If you're like me, you've committed to playing long-term games with long-term people. When I started my company, I made a 20-year commitment. And that is particularly true because I have niched to the construction industry. I have a deep commitment to serving and helping the people who own and run construction companies. And that commitment is ongoing. And even if you've just launched your construction company, if you know anything about the industry, you know that it's a relationship game and that those long-term commitments are necessary. And it's more than likely that you are aiming to build a business over years, if not decades. And therefore, it behooves you. It's important for you to begin to look at your succession planning, whether you've been in business for 1 year, 10 years, or 30 years. Another thing you have to consider, and this is one of the ways that Disney stumbled a little bit, is the announcement of the succession plan. Bob Iger played the decision of the announcement of the succession plan very much close to his chest. And it was a bit of a surprise for many people when he announced that Bob Chapek was going to be his successor. And this is something that you have to think through. On the one hand, you may not be anxious to share personal information about the business, the structure of the business, and the ownership right away with everyone, and that's fair enough. And that's one thing that I'd like to make an emphasis on as you're considering succession planning, is that there is no one way of doing things, and there is no magic pill when it comes to succession planning. It's a tremendously difficult thing to do. And just like you've built a business that is unique from any other business, your succession plan may be unique from any other business's succession plan. But just like there are fundamental principles that drive the success of a business regardless of who runs it, so too there are fundamental principles that drive the success of a succession plan, no matter who is putting it together. And one of those principles is how you roll out the succession plan, how you announce it, how you communicate it. And you should do it in such a way that people aren't caught by surprise. That is, the people who are affected by the succession plan. They have some inclination of what's going on. Because if you catch people by surprise with your succession planning announcement, don't be surprised if you fail to get the buy-in and the commitment to your plan that you're looking for. And then you have to think through very thoroughly, what is your timeline for executing that succession plan? And that's particularly true when you're focused on an internal sale, and perhaps you've identified candidates to take over the business from you, and yet you know that though they may have the willingness, they may have the motivation, they may even have the innate talent to take over the business from you, they are not yet ready from an experience or a wisdom perspective, and they need time to get comfortable with the responsibilities of taking over the business from you. And therefore, that execution runway is a bit longer than if you were just selling it to an outside party and then walking away. And so that leads to a very important thing for you to think through is who's going to be helping you with the succession plan. And obviously, there are external people that you need to bring on board to help you with the execution and the structure of the plan. But then the internal people are perhaps the most important. Actually, I'll take that back. If you're doing an internal sale, they are the most important. And this is a place of deep challenge because you may have people in mind who you'd like to take the business over from you. It could be family members. It could be people who've been committed to your business and working with you for many years. But just because you want them to doesn't mean that they want to or that they are able. I have one particular company in mind many years ago who began the succession process and had identified family members. And though the person who owned the company wanted it very much for the family owners to step into the business and to take it over, the family owners that they identified neither had the desire or the capacity. And going through that process of figuring that out was something that was very challenging, both to the individuals and to the family dynamic. And when you broach the subject of someone purchasing the company from you, particularly an internal candidate, it may at first blush seem something that is very appealing as they look at you and they see the truck that you drive and they speculate perhaps on the money that you're taking home, and they consider, well, that guy or that gal, they're no smarter than me. I could do this. And yet as they begin to perhaps see a little bit how the sausage is made from an ownership perspective, when they begin to understand the risks that you've taken on and how that risk has not only affected you personally, but has affected your family, then perhaps they begin to shy away from ownership responsibility. And whatever the case is, taking the time to identify those internal candidates and have those discussions and go through the process of succession planning is vital. And not only the internal candidates who are going to actually have some ownership in the business potentially, but also those internal candidates who are going to be filling key roles as you and your generation of leadership sunset from the business. And so Bob Iger chose Bob Chapek to be his successor for very, very good reasons. Bob Chapek is a low drama individual. He has a high degree of integrity and operational expertise. So I don't know about you, but having someone on board to succeed you that is low drama, high integrity, and a great operator, that may be a tremendous fit for your business. But it's interesting when you put a plan together. Dwight Eisenhower has a riff off of a very famous quote from another individual. And that quote is, "Every battle is going to surprise you. No plan ever survives contact with the enemy." And you may hear that quote and say, well, Eric, what's the point of doing succession planning? It's the process itself that will really help you to get clarity. And as you begin to execute that plan, yes, it will not survive contact with the enemy, so to speak. A great plan often goes awry because of the circumstances that are beyond the scope of the plan, or the weaknesses of a plan are exposed when they're executed and given an opportunity to contact the real world. Planning is a conceptual thing. Executing is another matter. But going through the planning process itself with a combination of execution will help you then to respond to the deficiencies in your plan or the gaps between your plan and reality. And the sooner you begin to plan and execute, the quicker you'll be able to get feedback from the real world on the quality of your succession plan and begin to make adjustments. So we've talked about the decision. And let me just say this. If you don't want to leave, then don't. Don't feel that because you've hit a certain number that in age, you're 60, 65, whatever the case is, if you've still got the juice, then stick around. But understand that time is passing and we are all going to die. And you must, if you want the company to stick around, put together and begin to consider that succession plan. Okay, let's talk about the structure, the second thing. Again, you're riding off into the sunset, you and the generation of folks who have built the business. You want to pass it on, particularly if we're talking about an internal sale. But even if you're talking about an external sale, let me make a point here. Obviously, they're going to be looking at your numbers and your bottom line when they are purchasing from you, someone externally, your profit and your loss. But they're also going to be looking at your team. And there's tremendous value in having a great team in place that can carry the business on, whether you decide to sell externally or internally. And you want to set them up for success. So with that in mind, every building has a foundation. It has a structural framework. And it also has an envelope an envelope that protects the building so that we haven't laid the foundation and put up the structural framework in vain. Let's talk about the foundation of a good succession plan. And it's something that often people miss. It's really understanding the roles and the responsibilities of the people who are going to be stepping into new roles in your organization and navigating the tension between what you do and what the next generation of people are going to do. And not just the role, but the responsibility and the areas of authority. And this is a challenge that many businesses have. It's sketching out and deciding on and committing to what is it that you're going to do and what is it that I am going to do, particularly as we're going through this succession process. This is something that Disney came across many times. Bob Chapek was the CEO in name, but the influence of Bob Iger often caused him to not be able to function as a CEO. And that was a problem in the succession with Disney. One of the things you're going to have to do if you're going to execute a succession is at some point you're going to have to give up some power. And one of the reasons why you've built a successful business is because you're good at utilizing power effectively. And that's a challenge for some people, is to yield power to others. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like some massive ego. You're just used to being in charge. You're used to getting stuff done, and you're used to getting it done in a particular way. But if you're going to do a succession plan where you're going to be yielding power at some point and in some manner to somebody else, you've got to come to terms with that process. And you've got to be comfortable with sketching out the lines of authority as it comes to people's roles and responsibilities. So if you've been responsible over the years for the final say on the go, no go, on whether you're going to take a project on, and that becomes someone else's role and responsibility at some point, you may often find yourself, or you may likely find yourself in a scenario where the person that you are passing the business onto or that particular role onto makes a decision on a project to go where you might say no. Or alternatively, think about this particularly. One of the reasons why you've built a successful business is that you've been willing to take on risk, and you may bring in some people into your business that are a little more risk adverse. And when you say go, they may say no. And that's why it's important to define those roles and responsibilities and figure out how you're going to go through that decision-making process. You also have to think about this idea of talents and skills. And this is particularly true for someone who has built their own business. They typically have a unique package of talent and skills. And because of that unique package, they do things that other people don't do. And one of the things that you have to think through is, what makes me unique? And am I able to identify people who can fill those areas of uniqueness sufficiently to continue the business on? You may be great at not only winning work, but planning and building it. And you may be pretty good at hustling around and getting paid for the work that you've done. But those skills and talents that you have may be something that has to be distributed throughout other people in the organization as that succession plan gets executed. And then you have to be able to put together a really strong foundation of metrics as you're going through the succession plan of what good performance is, what bad performance is, and what unacceptable performance is. You never want to begin to execute a succession plan where you have folks in new roles and responsibilities and be unclear on what they need to do to succeed, and be unclear on the measurements of that success. And this is particularly true when it comes to an internal succession, because going back to the idea of no plan ever surviving contact with the enemy, you may pick someone out for a succession plan, a position in that succession plan, even a position in ownership. And you may not give them the ownership right away, but you plot out a course for them to come into ownership. And as they're tracking through that course, it becomes evident through their performance that they're not a fit for the position that you thought that they might be. Don't be surprised when that happens. But make sure you have those metrics in place so that you know what to measure their performance against, so that you can understand relatively objectively whether or not they are stepping up to the plate and fulfilling a role that you intend for them to fill. And so going back to Bob Chapek and Bob Iger, they had this weird sort of power-sharing dynamic where when Chapek came on as a CEO, Iger stepped into an executive chairman role and the head of creative, which I think is deeply interesting. Because of the roles and responsibilities they both stepped into through the succession, I think that laid the foundation for the failure of the succession in many ways, particularly because as head of creative, Iger had a tremendous influence on what you might say is the engine of Disney's success, and that is their creative endeavors. And the logic of that you could understand because, again, Chapek was an operator and Iger had some real skill in creative, particularly in terms of building bridges with the creative folks out in Hollywood who drove a lot or drive a lot of the content that makes Disney Disney. But that then begs the question, why would you put someone like Chapek into the CEO role if he lacked that unique ability to interface and relate with the more creative side of the business? So again, think about, as you're doing your succession plan, what is my business and what are the needs of my business in terms of the people that I'm identifying as potential successors? You don't want to bring someone into a role that they're not suited for or into a business environment that their particular skill set is not suited for in terms of them being able to lead. So again, the company that Disney is or was when Chapek came in, if it was strictly an operational type company and the creativity aspects of it perhaps were not as important, then Chapek may have been a better fit. But the needs of the business did not fit with the skills and talents that Chapek brought to the table, or at least not some of the lack that Chapek had, was evident in the way that he operated as the CEO. And that leads to another important point. And I'd like to say this again, it goes back to the genius idea or the talent idea. There are things that you do instinctively. And one of the things that you have to focus on in your succession plan is making sure that you have your processes well mapped out. And you might say, Eric, I have a great process for estimating. I have a great process for building my work, for getting paid. And I'm very glad for that. But there's stuff in your head that needs to get out of your head and onto paper, so that someone who is stepping into your role understands some of those things that you do that even you don't understand what it is that you do. Some of the instinctive ways that you interact with people that you've just built up over the years. If you can get some of that stuff out of your head and onto paper so that others can see it and process it and put it into process, that may be very helpful for you as well. So what is that extra 5% that you bring to the table in winning work or planning work or building work or getting paid that isn't in any of your written down processes? That if you can get that out of your head again, I know I'm repeating myself here a little bit, but I'm making a point. Make sure that that's written down so that others can see it and that you can develop those processes for others to be able to execute once you move on. Another thing you want to think about as you're going through your succession plan, and I know this bites people a lot, is this idea of flight risks. Because as your business changes and goes from the first generation, let's say that's you, to the second generation, that can present challenges in terms of flight risks. And so why do people leave a business? They leave it for two main reasons. Number one, they don't like their managers, the people who they report to. Or number two, there's a lack of opportunity. And this is particularly true for talented people. There's a lack of opportunity. And so when you're addressing the people who may leave your business, those talented project managers, project executives, superintendents, business development folks, you need to make sure that they're engaged in your business in terms of workload, recognition, the autonomy that they have, opportunities for growth. All of these things are very important in terms of employee engagement and minimizing flight risk. But you must have an honest conversation. You must be able to sit down with the people in your organization who are either part of the succession plan from an ownership perspective or from an execution perspective, and do whatever you can to clarify with them what their ambitions are, what their expectations are, and make sure that there is as much alignment as possible when it comes to the realities of the business and their expectations and their ambitions. Okay, we talked about the foundation. Let's talk about the structural framework then. And this is where a lot of conflict comes in when it comes to the business. Think about your org chart at the moment in terms of winning work, planning work, building work, and getting paid. As you're going through your succession plan, you should be laying out what your org chart looks like today, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. Again, you might be saying, Eric, I have no idea where my business will be 5 years from now. Fair enough. But go through the conceptual exercise, because as you're doing succession planning, and I sure hope that you're not just going to do it because you need to sell the business or transition the business in the next 24 months, but as you're taking a long-term approach to succession planning, you need to think through your org chart and the roles that will need to be filled and the people who could potentially fill them. And always take the perspective of a general manager in sports, where you not only have people who are filling the role currently, but you are building a bench of talent. And I know as I say this, you may be thinking, Eric, you're talking like a consultant here. I've got a business to run. And I'll say, I know I'm talking like a consultant, but you do need to run your business using these principles that I'm laying out here. It's a part of running your business, going through this succession planning process and thinking through the structure of your organizational chart and thinking about which roles you need to fill and where you're going to tap the talent to fill those roles. This is your job. And so if you can't carve out time to do this type of planning and thinking, then that tells you something about where you are in your business. And you should ask yourself, what are the things that I'm allowing? What are the things I'm allowing that are taking me away from working on my business as opposed to just in my business all the time? Because what we're talking about with succession planning is working on your business. So how do we need to grow the business to retain talent? That's an interesting question. What's going to make people want to stick around? I know many businesses that go into new lines of business in construction as a strategy to retain talent. It's something you should consider. And when it comes to development, you need to put in place a strong performance management system where you're aligning people's aspirations and their potential for growth with their current performance. Because if people have a sense that they can grow in your business and that their potential can be met, it's far more likely that when your competitors down the street come knocking with an extra 10 or 20 grand a year, it's far more likely that at least they'll come back to you with that offer and say, hey, listen, I want to stick with your company and I have aspirations to grow with your company. So you must be committed to strong performance management when it comes to your succession plan. And that can also lead you then to thinking about hiring, because as you look at your org chart in the future, and you look at the talent base that you have internally right now, you may need to be doing some hiring, and that's fair enough. And if that's the case, you need to tune in your recruiting process to find, attract, and then filter through candidates so that you get the right people in the right seats in your organization. So you see, succession planning is not just working with the talent that you have internally, but then also identifying talent externally who you may need to bring into the business. Okay. Now let's talk about the envelope of that structure. We've talked about the foundation, the structural framework. What about the envelope? In any business, there are going to be ups and downs, problems and crises. And when the crisis hits, this is when you need to have a strong protective mechanism in place in your business to ride through the crises. So you protect your business by agreeing to and communicating the decisions around the succession plan. And it's really interesting, as Chapek came into the CEO seat, he immediately began to encounter some challenges, such as COVID-19, political issues in places like Florida, and internal dynamics that perhaps he hadn't anticipated or planned for, and that certainly weren't helped by the structural nature of the roles and responsibilities between Bob Chapek and Bob Iger that I discussed earlier. And all of those things presented challenges to him. And unfortunately, based on the way the succession plan had been structured and the internal political dynamics in Disney, that actually led in many ways to his failure as the CEO. And you'll see that many times when the crisis comes up, it creates conflict. And if you're going to execute this succession plan well, you must be able to go through conflict. And the problem with Disney is they have this culture of being Disney nice. And Disney nice is effective when you're looking to build a business and times are good. But it perhaps is not as effective when times are challenging. Because being Disney nice can often lead to not dealing with the issues, to a sort of a shut up experience in a business where we don't talk about the issues. And that doesn't work. You must be willing to address issues. So how do you do that? Well, you have to be able to engage in healthy conflict. And when it comes to any kind of succession plan, you're going to find conflict. And so to engage in healthy conflict, you have to be able to address issues with people. And you must be specific about what those issues are. You can't say you always and you never. If someone has an issue, let's say they're in a role where customer service is key and they have an issue with customer service, you must address that issue. And you must be able to say to them, with this particular client, when an issue like this comes up, you must address it in a very clear manner. So be specific when you're dealing with issues. Describe your emotions around an issue. And the reason why that's important is because in describing your emotions, you're able to communicate to someone the importance of the issue. Because whenever you're dealing with conflict resolution, you have to be able to think through what's really at stake. So for instance, when you promote someone into a role where their journey is towards the C-suite or towards ownership in the business and an issue comes up, you have to be able to look them in the eye and let them know what type of an issue this is. In other words, you should be able to say to them, if you can't address this issue, then this is going to have an impact on your ability to be an owner of the business. If that's the case, you don't want to over-amplify the issue, but you don't want to underplay it. You must be able to clearly identify what's at stake. And if you've contributed in any way to the issue because of the way you've structured the succession plan or because of the way you're behaving, you have to identify that. I'd be interested to sort of do a rewind and ask if Bob Iger could come to Bob Chapek and say, hey, listen, I know we've structured this a little bit challengingly where I have some creative responsibilities that perhaps I should have delegated to you in some way and been more open with those issues. That might have helped the dynamic, but it's really interesting. Bob Iger and Bob Chapek apparently spent a lot of time talking to other people about their issues, but not face-to-face with one another. And so you have to be able to do that, particularly with the people that you've identified as your successors, because I promise you that they are going to do stuff that's going to disappoint you, and you must be able to deal with that. And then come to an agreement. Indicate your wish to resolve issues and say, hey, listen, part of the process, doing something that's very difficult, I know you want to deal with these issues. Let's work together for the benefit of the company and for the future legacy of the organization. So that leads me to the last thing I'd like to talk about, and that's the lessons. And again, if you're watching on YouTube here, you see the meme I put together. You've made a plan to move on, but then you end up sticking around, and that's exactly what happened at Disney. And that's why you must start now in your succession plan, and not only in the planning part, but starting the execution part as well, because you will find that your plan does not survive contact with reality, and that's perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. It puts you in a place where you can then adapt as necessary, and if you're willing to adapt, that can then increase the likelihood of you being able to execute a successful succession plan over the long term. And if you really don't want to go anywhere, be perfectly clear about that. Again, I said it earlier, I'll say it again. If you don't want to leave, don't leave. But if you're beginning to get to the end of your run, or if you're starting your run and you're smart, get your succession plan in place. One of the dynamics at Disney, which I found interesting, was that Bob Iger called himself Big Bob, and he called Bob Chapek Little Bob. And there's always room for joking around in an organization. And the reason why comedy is often so impactful is because it tells the truth. And I think the truth, again, from an outsider's perspective, is that Bob Iger really considered himself Big Bob and Bob Chapek as Little Bob. And as a result of that, was never really out at Disney and never really committed to the succession plan that he put together and kind of set it up for failure from the very beginning. Not necessarily consciously, but perhaps unconsciously. And I'd like to make a note there. The people that you are bringing into your succession plan, you should admire them in some way. You should admire their abilities. And I'm sure that Bob Iger admired Bob Chapek's abilities. But again, the abilities that Bob Chapek has weren't necessarily the right fit for the business needs of Disney or the structure that was put in place by Bob Iger for the succession plan. And so if you admire someone, make sure that you're setting them up for success in terms of a succession plan. And realize the succession plan that we're talking about is a journey. And it's something where you're going to find success and failure. And that's why you need to give yourself as much runway as possible. So we've talked about the decision, whether you're going to move on or stick around. We've talked about the structure, setting up a succession plan successfully so that as you go into the sunset, you can pass it on to the next generation. And we've talked about the lessons learned. And those lessons learned should be hammered into you so that you don't end up sticking around when you really should have moved on. The Disney succession between Iger and Chapek was not a success. In 2022, Iger came back and began working on growth, began addressing some of the issues, and as you might imagine, committed that next time things were going to be different. Going back to The Lion King, at the beginning of the movie, the baby lion was presented as the successor. The succession apparently didn't work to begin with, and at the end of the movie, we see the resolution of the baby becoming king and passing it on to the next generation. Who knows whether your succession is going to work like that, but it is definitely time for you to get into action. And if you don't have a plan, now's the time to start putting it in place. And with that in mind, I'd like to offer you a resource that you can take advantage of. And that is the succession planning framework that I use with all of my clients. And if you're on YouTube right now, you can see the table of contents for that plan. And you can also then see the QR code on YouTube, scan that QR code, and go and download the plan. It's free to you. If there's one takeaway that I would encourage you to get from this podcast episode, we're about an hour in, is to take that plan and at least go through the questionnaire with your executive team in the next 90 days. You can go to my website, constructiongenius.com/free-succession-planning-guide. What an awful URL. And get the plan. The link is in the show notes. And again, if you're listening, but you want to check out the YouTube video, do that. And by the way, while you're there, subscribe to the channel. And you can get all of the podcast episodes and other content that I produce through my YouTube channel. Thank you for listening today. I'll give you one final plug in terms of the external folks. If you're looking for someone to help you with your succession planning process, it's something that I work with my clients on a regular basis. And so you can contact me on my website, constructiongenius.com/contact. We can have a quick chat about if or how I can help you. But regardless of whether or not you ever contact me, you can go and get that free download. And you'll find that framework to be tremendously helpful. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius today. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. And I will catch you on the next one.